What's the cutest thing your parents have done for each other? My parents had a game that ran for 40 years that I did not know about until I was 31, and the reason I didn't know is that it was quiet enough to be invisible to a child and only legible when you're old enough to recognize patience as a love language. The game was this. Anytime either of them said, "I love you," in public, anywhere strangers could hear, the other one had to find the person standing nearest to them and give that person a genuine, specific compliment, out loud. A real one. Not nice shoes. Something observed. They had to look at a stranger and name something true. My dad had a rule that it had to be about something the person was doing, not about how they looked, because he thought appearance compliments were the easiest ones and the least likely to be believed, and what he wanted was for a stranger to carry home something accurate about themselves that they hadn't expected to be given that day. I saw my dad do it at a grocery store when I was small and thought he was just being friendly, which was its own kind of accurate. I didn't understand the rule. I didn't understand that it was a response to my mom's voice across the produce section, that the two events were connected, that my dad had been waiting for her to say it so he could find the nearest person and make their Tuesday slightly better. I found out the full story last spring when my mom told me on a drive home from a doctor's appointment in the flat, practical voice she uses when she is transmitting things she needs someone else to carry. She said my dad had invented the game 3 months after they got together because he had noticed that my mom, who had grown up in a house where kindness was private and conditional, relaxed in public spaces where strangers were gentle with each other, and he wanted to fill the world around her with small, unexpected warmth. And the rule meant that every time she said, "I love you," out loud, the universe gave a compliment to a stranger, and over 40 years she had said it several thousand times. And the math of that is staggering. My mom told me that after my dad died, she started doing it alone, which she said felt strange but also correct. And she kept doing it even without the game structure, because it had become the thing she did when she missed him. And the combination of the two, the grief and the compliment, had the effect of making her feel that he was still, in some sense, producing the warmth that surrounded her. She told me that 3 months ago, a man at her grocery store had been standing near her when she said, "I love you," to my dad's photo on her phone the way she sometimes does when she passes through a space they shared, and she had turned to find the nearest person to compliment, and the nearest person was this man, and she had told him something true about the way he was being patient with the person ahead of him in line who was taking a long time, and he had looked at her and said, without missing a beat, "The woman who always talks to the vegetables. I was hoping to meet you." She told me that for 6 months she had been walking through that store saying quiet things to the tomatoes and the squash, things she'd have said to my dad, and this man had been a regular there and had heard her without saying anything and had found it, he said, the loveliest thing he witnessed all week, every week. She said they had talked for 20 minutes in the cereal aisle, and she had laughed twice, genuinely, the way she used to laugh with my dad, and when she told me this, she was not crying, she was smiling, and she said she didn't know what to make of it, and I said it sounded like something was beginning, and she said, "I know, and I don't know if I'm allowed." And I said, "Dad set up the game so you'd be surrounded by warmth. I think he planned for this." And she got quiet, and then she said, "He left something in the cabinet behind the cookbooks. There's a letter. I haven't opened it. He said it was for when I was ready." And I asked her if she was ready, and she said, "I think that's why I'm telling you. I think I need you there when I do." I drove to Nerida's house the next morning, and I had not slept because I had spent the whole night lying in bed trying to imagine what a man who had spent 40 years walking up to strangers and saying true things would write to his wife. For the moment, she was ready to let someone new stand close to her. What do you say when you know you won't be there? What does a man who believed in looking, really looking, write for the one time he can't be in the room to see what happens next? I didn't have answers, and the not knowing kept me awake until the sky started getting light, and I just got up and made coffee and drove. I went inside and Nerida was not ready. I knew it the second I stepped into the kitchen because she was cleaning. The kitchen was already spotless. It is always spotless. But she was wiping the counter in slow circles with a cloth, pressing hard like she was trying to get something out of the granite that wasn't there, and she was talking about the grout. She ran her finger along a line between 2 tiles near the stove and said, "I've been meaning to get the grout between these tiles redone. I was thinking of calling someone this week." I stood in the doorway and watched her, and I recognized it, the way I've recognized it my whole life, because this is what Nerida does when she is scared. She builds walls out of small tasks. She puts chores between herself and the thing she doesn't want to face, and the smaller the chore, the bigger the thing, and grout is very small, which meant the thing was very big. She wiped the counter again, the same spot, the same circle, and then she said, "I was thinking maybe we should do this another day. There's no rush." And I almost agreed. I had the words right there in my mouth ready to go, and they would have been so easy to say, and they would have been completely wrong. I caught myself, because she hadn't asked me to come here so I could give her an exit. She had asked me to come here so there would be someone in the room who wouldn't let her leave. "Mom," I said, "you asked me to be here. I'm here." Nerida stopped wiping. Her hand went still on the counter, and she stood there for a second looking at the cloth, and then she folded it, carefully, into a perfect square, the way she folds everything. Like neatness is the last line of defense between her and whatever is coming. She set the cloth down on the counter, and she said quietly, "What if it says something I can't carry?" And I understood what she was really asking, which was not about the weight of the words, but about the direction of them, because she was afraid that Preston had written something that would close the door she had just barely started to open, that his last words to her would be a claim on her future, rather than a release of it. "Then I'll carry it with you," I said. "That's why you asked me." She nodded slowly, the kind of nod that takes effort, and then she turned and walked to the cabinet. I watched her pull a cookbook to the side, then another, and then she reached behind the row of them into the space between the books and the back wall of the cabinet, and she pulled out an envelope. It was a plain white envelope, a little soft at the edges from being tucked there for years, and it was not sealed. It had never been sealed, just tucked, folded shut, resting there in the dark behind the cookbooks like it had been waiting patiently, which I guess it had. Preston's handwriting was on the front. It said only, "Nerida, when you're ready, you'll know." His handwriting was neat, the kind of handwriting that comes from a generation that still cared about penmanship, and seeing it right there on the envelope made my chest feel full in a way I wasn't ready for, because handwriting is the thing that stays the most like a person after they're gone, more than photos, more than recordings, because it carries the motion of their hand. Nerida held the envelope and her hands were steady, which surprised me, but my mother is not someone who hesitates once she commits. She only hesitates before, and the hesitation was over now, and what was was left was the doing. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I ate breakfast for 18 years, the table that has held every important conversation this family has ever had, and she set the envelope in front of her and opened the flap and pulled out a single folded page. She began to read it silently. I sat across from her and watched her face, and I saw it change, not into tears. I was ready for tears. What I saw was something else. Confusion. Her brow pulled together slightly and she read it again, from the top, slower, and then she looked up at me and said, "It's not what I thought." "What does it say?" I asked. Narita turned the letter around and slid it across the table so I could read it. I pulled it toward me and looked down at my dad's handwriting, and I read it, and what I had expected was permission. I had been bracing for something like, "Move on," or "Be happy," or "I want you to find someone," some version of a blessing from the grave, the noble goodbye, the generous release. What I read was none of those things. The letter was short. It said, "Narita, if you're reading this, then something has happened that made you think you needed my permission. You don't. You never did. But since you're here, I have one last round of the game for you. I need you to find the nearest person to you right now, and I need you to tell them something true about themselves that they don't know yet. A real one, not easy. Something observed. I'll go first. The person nearest to you right now is probably our daughter, and the thing she doesn't know yet is that she has been playing the game her whole life without being told the rules. She has always looked at people and found something true. She got that from watching us. Now, it's your turn. Tell her what you see. I love you. The game doesn't end. Preston." I read it twice. I read it 3 times. I looked up from the letter and Narita was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something that lived between recognition and grief, and the very beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet, and neither of us spoke for a long moment because my dad, who had been dead for over a year, had just taken his turn. I was inside the game. I was not the audience. I was the stranger standing nearest, the one my dad had turned to and found something true about, except I was not a stranger. I was his daughter, and he had been looking at me my whole life, and I hadn't known he was keeping score. "Dad wrote this about me?" I finally said, and my voice sounded like it belonged to someone younger than me, someone still small enough to be surprised by what her parents saw when they looked at her. Narita nodded. "He wrote it years ago," she said. "Look at the date." I looked down at the bottom of the letter, and there was a date written in the same neat handwriting, tucked into the corner, and the date was 4 years before Preston died. 4 years. He wrote this when he was healthy. He was not sick when he sat down and wrote these words. He was not making arrangements. He was making a move. He had been planning this for years, not as some last goodbye from a man who knew his time was running out, but as a deliberate, patient move in a game he had always intended to outlast him. The game was bigger than his body. He had built it that way on purpose. He used to say the game wasn't about the compliments. Narita said quietly. It was about the looking. He said most people stop looking at each other after the first year of knowing someone, really looking. You learn someone's face and their habits and the way they hold their coffee, and then you stop updating the picture because you think you've got it, and the game forced him to keep looking. At strangers, at me, at you. He said the hardest part was finding something new about someone you've known for decades, and the easiest part was finding something true about a stranger. And the skill, the real skill, was learning to treat the people you love like strangers you're seeing for the first time. I felt something move in my chest when she said that. My father had been studying me for 31 years. He had been looking at me the way he looked at strangers in grocery stores and parking lots, with that same careful focus, that same commitment to finding something true. And he had written down what he found and tucked it behind cookbooks in a dark cabinet and trusted that the right day would come. "Are you going to do it?" I asked. "The last round. Are you going to tell me something true?" Narita looked at me for a long time, long enough that I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, and she had that look on her face that I recognized from years of watching her think, the look that meant she was sorting through options and discarding the ones that were close but not right. Then she said, "Not yet. I need to think about it. Your father never rushed. He always waited until he had the right one. So I let it go. And because the letter hadn't mentioned Rudy at all and the silence in the kitchen was starting to feel heavy, I asked about him instead. Have you seen him again, Rudy?" Narita's face did something small and private, a softening around her eyes that she probably didn't know she was doing. "Yes," she said. 3 more times, at the store. She picked up the folded cloth from the counter and set it down again, which was just her hands needing something to do. "He's not like your father," she said, and the way she said it was not sad, it was just factual. Your father listened like he was collecting material, like every conversation was research for the next compliment. Rudy listens like he's just glad to be in the room. He said hearing me talk to the vegetables had made him feel like the world still had people in it who spoke to things gently. She paused. He said that. Spoke to things gently. Your father would have liked that sentence. 2 weeks went by. I called Narita every other day and I could hear the change in her voice the way you can hear when someone has opened a window in a room that's been closed for a long time. She mentioned Rudy, not in a big way, not like she was making an announcement. She mentioned him the way you mention the weather or what you had for lunch, casually, tucked into the middle of other things. And that was how I knew it mattered, because Narita only tucks important things into the middle of sentences. She never puts them at the front where they'd have to stand alone and be examined. She told me Rudy had made a joke about cereal brands, something about how the ones with cartoon animals on the box always taste better than the ones that try to look healthy. And she laughed while she told me this. And I recognized what she was doing because she used to do it with Preston. She used to relay things he had said with this faint smile in her voice, like the memory of the sentence was still warm in her mouth, and now she was doing it with Rudy's words. But she had not completed the last round of the game. She had not told me the true thing. I didn't ask. I didn't push. I waited, the way Preston would have waited. Then Narita called on a Thursday evening, and I knew something was different the second I heard her voice because it was tight, pulled in at the edges, the way thread looks right before it snaps. "Rudy asked me to have dinner with him," she said. "Not at the grocery store, at a restaurant, a real dinner." She paused, and I could hear her breathing, careful and measured. "I said yes," she said. "I said yes, and then I drove home and sat down in the kitchen and cried for 20 minutes. I asked her if she was sad. "No," she said. "I'm scared. What if I laugh with him the way I laughed with your father and it means the laughing wasn't special?" She said it fast, like she had been carrying it in her mouth for days, and I could hear in her voice that this was the real fear. Not that the dinner would go badly, but that it would go well, and that going well would somehow reach backward through time and make the 40 years with Preston worth less. "Mom, Mom, I said, and I made sure my voice was steady because she needed steady right now. The laughing was always special. It doesn't stop being special because it happens again. The line was quiet for a second. Then Nerida said softly, your father would have said something like that. And I said, I know. I learned it from watching him. She asked me to come over the night before the dinner. I drove over after work the next Wednesday and let myself in the front door and found Nerida sitting at the kitchen table, and the letter was in front of her, unfolded, Preston's handwriting facing up like it had been waiting there all day. She looked up at me when I walked in and she said, I think I'm ready to finish the round. I sat down across from her. I didn't say anything. The kitchen was quiet, the way it gets in the evening when the light turns gold and the house settles into itself. Nerida looked at me, and I felt something happen that I had heard about my whole life, but had never been on the receiving end of, because she was looking at me the way Preston used to look at strangers in checkout lines, with that specific kind of focus that makes you feel like every part of you is being read at once, like someone has decided that right now, in this moment, you are the most important text in the room, and they are going to get it right. Nerida started to speak, and then stopped. She pressed her lips together, shook her head slightly, started again. Your father said the hardest compliments are for the people you know best, she said, because you have to find something new, something they haven't heard. She stopped again and folded her hands together on the table, and I could see her working through it, discarding the ones that were close but not right. But I've been looking at you for 31 years, she said, and the thing I see is not new. It's the thing I've always seen and never said because I thought you already knew. She paused. The kitchen clock ticked. I waited. Nerida said, the thing that's true about you, the thing you don't know, is that you have always been the bravest person in this family, not your father. You. I opened my mouth to argue because that was wrong. Preston was the brave one. Preston was the man who spent 40 years walking up to complete strangers and saying true things to their faces. Preston invented the whole game. And I started to say that, but Nerida shook her head before I could get the words out. Your father was brave with strangers, she said. That was his gift. But you have always been brave with the people who could actually hurt you. You say the hard thing to the person who matters. You told me to open the letter. You told me it sounded like something was beginning. You just told me the laughing was still special. Your father could compliment a stranger in a parking lot, but he couldn't tell his own mother that she was wrong about me for 15 years. You would have told her in the first week. I did not know what to say. I sat there with my hands flat on the table and nothing coming out, because she was right and I had never thought about it that way. Not once in 31 years. I had spent my whole life thinking that my parents' love story was between the two of them and I was a witness. Someone lucky enough to grow up in the same house as something extraordinary but always on the outside of it, watching through glass, close enough to feel the warmth but never inside the fire. Nerida said, you were always inside it. Every time your father looked at a stranger and found something true, he was practicing for the moments that mattered. The ones at home. The ones with you. I was crying. I didn't try to stop it. I just let it come, quiet and steady, the way rain comes when it's been building all day. Nerida folded the letter carefully, pressing the crease with her thumb the way she presses everything, and she slid it across the table to me. It weighed almost nothing. A single page in a soft white envelope, light enough to forget you were holding it, heavy enough to rearrange the inside of your chest. Nerida said, I'm going to have dinner with Rudy tomorrow, and I'm going to be scared, and I'm going to do it anyway. And if at any point during that dinner I say, I love you to the air the way I do, I'm going to find the nearest person and tell them something true, and the game will keep going, and your father will still be in it, and so will I, and so will you. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, warm and steady, her fingers curling around my knuckles the way they used to when I was small and we were crossing a street. You asked me if I was ready, she said. I'm telling you I am. Not because the grief is done, because the game is bigger than the grief. I drove home that night with the letter on the passenger seat, and I stopped at a gas station to get coffee, and there was a teenager behind the counter drumming quietly on the edge of the register with 2 pens, keeping a complicated rhythm while staring at nothing, the way you practice something you love when you think no one is paying attention. I said, you've got really good rhythm. The kid looked up, startled, then grinned so wide I could see his back teeth. I got back in the car and the game didn't end. I called Nerida the next morning. She said the dinner went well. She laughed 3 times. She said I love you to the air once, quietly, while Rudy was looking at the menu, and then she turned to the nearest table and told an elderly man that the way he had pulled out his wife's chair was one of the most graceful things she'd ever seen. The man tipped his head like he'd been given a gift. Nerida said, Rudy noticed. He asked what I was doing. I told him it was a long story. I said, are you going to tell him? Nerida said, I think I'm going to teach him to play. I was about to hang up when she said, oh, one more thing. When I got home last night, there was a second envelope tucked behind the first one in the cabinet. Same handwriting. My name on the front. Her voice went quiet. I don't know how I missed it all these years. I must have only pulled the first one. It's sealed. This one. Actually sealed. I didn't say anything for a second. Then I said, did you open it? She said, no, it's not addressed to me. She paused. It's addressed to you.